The early autumn sun cast a warm glow across the cracked sidewalks as Madeline Wilson navigated her wheelchair through her familiar neighborhood. 70 years old, Madeline had lived in this community for more than 3 decades. She knew each crack in the pavement, each alleyway, and the faces of the families who had grown up around her. Her hands gripped the wheels of her chair with a gentle determination, her eyes taking in the sights around her with a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had just completed a trip to the bank, and though the trip was simple, each outing was a reminder of her independence. Madeline's son, Julian, had offered many times to handle errands for her, but she'd always refused. While Julian had grown into a powerful, respected civil rights lawyer, Madeline had taught him from a young age the importance of resilience and self-reliance. She wanted him to understand that, no matter what, dignity wasn't something that anyone could take from you unless you gave it to them. As she turned onto a quieter street, heading toward her modest home, her thoughts drifted to Julian. He was her pride, her legacy, a testament to the values she'd worked so hard to instill. And despite her physical limitations, she was determined to remain strong. She had taught Julian to hold his head high, and she lived by those same principles. But today, as she rounded the corner, her peaceful afternoon took an unexpected turn. 2 police officers, one tall and muscular with a shaved head, the other shorter and stockier, were standing at the other end of the street. They both wore expressions of bored authority, their eyes scanning the neighborhood until they landed on her. As soon as they noticed her, their gazes shifted, becoming sharper, harder. "Hey, you!" the taller officer barked as they walked toward her. Madeline paused, her hands resting on her wheels. "Yes, officer?" she replied politely, her heart beating just a bit faster. "Let me see your ID," he demanded, his tone sharp and commanding. Madeline frowned in confusion. "My ID? Is there a problem, officer?" The stocky officer stepped forward, his gaze cold. "We ask the questions," he snapped. "Just show us your ID." Taken aback but unwilling to argue, Madeline reached into her handbag, her hands shaking slightly as she retrieved her identification. She had no reason to fear. She reminded herself, this was her home, her community. She handed over her ID, watching as the taller officer snatched it from her hand. After a quick glance, he passed it to his partner. "This ID looks fake," he muttered with a sneer. "Are you sure this is yours?" Madeline's voice hardened as she replied, "Yes, it's mine. I've lived here for more than 30 years. That ID is as real as it gets." The stocky officer let out a low, humorless chuckle. "You don't look like someone who belongs here. What are you doing in this part of town?" She felt a chill spread through her, the weight of their words pressing down on her. She met their stares, her voice steady but laced with disbelief. "I came from the bank. I live right down the street." The taller officer scoffed, sarcasm dripping from his voice. "Sure you do. And I'm the mayor." His partner, now emboldened, stepped forward, his face twisted with suspicion. "What's in the bag?" he demanded, pointing to her handbag. "You carrying anything you shouldn't be?" A flare of frustration surged within her, but Madeline kept her composure. "It's just my personal belongings," she replied. "You have no right to go through my things." But her calm resistance only seemed to fuel the officer's hostility. The stocky officer leaned in closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "We have every right," he said coldly, reaching out to grab the bag from her lap. A flash of anger sparked within Madeline as she watched him rifle through her belongings, tossing them onto the sidewalk. She had done nothing wrong, And yet these men were treating her as if she were a criminal. Each item that hit the ground was a reminder of her helplessness, of the unjust reality she had hoped her son's work could somehow improve. "Stop that," she demanded, her voice shaking with anger. "You have no right to do this." The taller officer smirked, his gaze filled with disdain. "People like you need to learn to respect the law." "People like me?" Madeline repeated, her voice rising. But even as she spoke, she felt the weight of their cruelty, their determination to dehumanize her. She was just an elderly woman returning from the bank. Yet these men seemed intent on humiliating her. The taller officer exchanged a look with his partner and motioned toward her wheelchair. "You're coming with us," he said, his tone cold and final. Madeline's voice quivered with fury as she asked, "Arrested? For what?" The stocky officer grabbed the handles of her wheelchair, ignoring her protests as he began pushing her toward the squad car. Madeline's heart raced as she struggled against his grip, but she was no match for his strength. Desperation filled her voice as she shouted, "I haven't done anything wrong. Let me go." Her words seemed to fall on deaf ears as the officer continued pushing her forward. She realized with a sinking feeling that they had no intention of listening. In that moment, her strength felt small against the unyielding force of their authority. As they neared the squad car, Madeline's heart pounded with a mixture of fear and anger. She had never been treated with such cruelty, not even during the turbulent years of her youth. She looked around, hoping to catch the attention of someone who might witness her distress. But the street was quiet. The officers stopped beside the car, the taller one pulling out a pair of handcuffs with a cruel glint in his eye. As he reached for her wrists, Madeline's instincts kicked in, and she shoved him with all the strength she could muster. He stumbled back, momentarily caught off guard by her defiance. The stocky officer's face twisted with rage as he tightened his grip on her wheelchair. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life, lady," he growled. Before she could react, the taller officer recovered and slapped her across the face with brutal force. The impact sent a blinding pain across her cheek, and her head snapped to the side. She tasted blood as her lips split, her vision blurring with tears. The world around her spun, her senses overwhelmed by pain and humiliation. She was barely aware of the people who had begun to gather, their faces a mix of shock and horror as they watched the scene unfold. She tried to lift her head, but the strength that had carried her through life's challenges felt like it was slipping away. A voice from the crowd cut through the chaos, filled with indignation. "Leave her alone." The officers whipped their heads around, glaring at the growing crowd. A woman stepped forward, her face etched with anger as she pointed her phone at them, recording every second of their brutality. "She didn't do anything wrong," the woman shouted, her voice trembling with emotion. The stocky officer glared at her, his hand moving toward his taser. "This doesn't concern you. Move back." But the crowd didn't back down. More people began to step forward, their voices rising in protest. Phones were raised, cameras rolling, capturing the injustice that was playing out before them. "You can't do this," someone yelled, their voice filled with defiance. "This is police brutality." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the crowd was growing bolder. But their aggression didn't waver. The stocky officer grabbed Madeline's arm, yanking her up from the ground as if she were nothing more than a rag doll. Madeline could barely stay conscious, her body weakened by pain and exhaustion. But she refused to cry out, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She was dimly aware of the voices around her, the words of support and outrage that reminded her she was not alone. And then, through the fog of pain, she heard a familiar voice, a voice that filled her with a renewed sense of strength. "That's enough." The voice was deep, commanding, and filled with an unmistakable anger. The officers froze, their eyes scanning the crowd as they tried to locate the source. The crowd parted, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man with a determined stride and an expression of simmering rage. It was Julian. Julian Wilson's face was a mask of controlled fury as he stepped forward. The sharp autumn sunlight glinted off his tailored suit, his powerful frame cutting a formidable figure in the midst of the crowd. Every step he took was measured, each one carrying the weight of his anger and grief as he locked eyes with the two officers who stood over his mother. The taller officer's sneer faltered for a split second, a hint of unease flickering in his eyes as Julian closed the distance between them. But his partner, the stockier officer, squared his shoulders, attempting to hold his ground. "Who the hell are you?" the stocky officer snapped, his voice loud but tinged with uncertainty. Julian's gaze was unflinching as he stopped directly in front of them. His voice was low, but each word was laced with an anger that vibrated through the crowd. "I'm her son," he said, his tone cold as steel. "And I'm also Julian Wilson, attorney at law." The name alone was enough to send a ripple through the gathering crowd. Julian Wilson was a respected lawyer with a reputation for fighting against systemic injustice, a name that carried weight in both legal and activist circles. The officers exchanged a brief glance, a crack appearing in their once confident expressions. Julian's eyes narrowed as he looked down at his mother. Her lip was split, blood staining her cheek. Her body crumpled on the cold pavement. The sight twisted something deep within him, the image of his proud, strong mother reduced to this, to the humiliation and degradation inflicted by these men. With an unshakable calm, he turned back to the officers. "You just assaulted a defenseless, elderly woman in a wheelchair," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper but laced with venom. "My mother, and you will answer for this." The taller officer attempted to muster his former arrogance, his gaze hardening as he looked Julian up and down. "We're handling official police business here. You'd best step back." Julian didn't flinch. He was done with pleasantries and pretense. "Handling it?" he repeated, his voice icy. "I've seen what handling it looks like. You've broken the law. You've committed battery and abuse of power. And you're standing here with the audacity to act like you're untouchable." The crowd murmured louder, the energy shifting as people began to step closer. Emboldened by Julian's words, more phones were raised, more voices whispering among themselves. The officers looked around, sensing that their authority was quickly crumbling beneath the weight of public scrutiny. The stocky officer squared up, trying to regain control of the situation. "You can't interfere with police business," he said, his voice filled with false confidence as his hand hovered over his taser. "Step away, or you'll be in handcuffs, too." Julian's expression didn't change, but his voice dropped, colder and sharper than before. "Lay another hand on her, and I will see you both prosecuted to the full extent of the law," he said. "I'll make sure you lose those badges and never work in law enforcement again." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. A woman near the front of the gathering, her eyes blazing with fury, raised her voice. "You can't treat her like that. Justice for Madeline." The crowd began to chant, their voices rising in unison. "Justice for Madeline! Justice for Madeline!" The officers' confidence wavered, and they exchanged a look of frustration, realizing that their hold on the situation was slipping. The taller officer looked at Julian, his expression taut. Fine. If you want to escalate this, we'll call our supervisor. Julian folded his arms, his voice calm but unyielding. Do that. In fact, I insist. Call for backup. Call your supervisor. Call whoever you need. Because today, you're going to answer for what you've done. The taller officer's hand shook slightly as he grabbed his radio. His voice strained as he called in for a supervising officer. The stocky officer muttered something under his breath. His gaze locked on Julian with a mix of resentment and defiance. But Julian didn't waver. He knelt beside his mother, his expression softening as he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here. I'm so sorry I wasn't here sooner." Madeline looked up at him, her face battered but her spirit unbroken. She managed a faint, pained smile. "You're here now, Julian," she whispered, her voice weak but steady. "That's all that matters." Julian felt a pang in his chest as he took her hand, gripping it tightly. The anger and helplessness he felt threatened to break through his composure. But he knew he had to stay focused. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about standing up to an abuse of power, about sending a message that this kind of brutality would no longer be tolerated. The sound of sirens cut through the air as 2 additional squad cars pulled up to the scene. An older officer stepped out, his expression weary as he took in the crowd, the officers, and the battered woman lying on the ground. This was the supervisor, and from the look on his face, he knew this was not a situation he could brush aside. "What's going on here?" the supervisor demanded, his gaze sweeping over the crowd before landing on the 2 officers. Julian rose to his full height, his voice calm but unwavering as he addressed the supervisor. "What's going on is that these 2 officers assaulted my mother without cause," he said, his words cutting through the air with precision. "They beat her while she was in a wheelchair. This is police brutality, plain and simple, and I intend to see them held accountable." The supervisor's expression hardened as he turned to the officers. "Is that true?" he asked, his tone carrying a warning edge. The taller officer fumbled for words, his face pale. She was resisting," he mumbled, but the conviction in his voice was gone. Julian's voice cut in, sharp and clear. "A 70-year-old woman in a wheelchair was resisting? That's the best excuse you can come up with." The crowd murmured in agreement, their outrage palpable. A young man in the front row of the crowd raised his phone higher. "We've got it all on camera," he called out. "Every single second." The supervisor's gaze shifted to the crowd, taking in the sea of recording phones and the indignant faces of the onlookers. He could see the writing on the wall, the clear truth that these officers had crossed a line they couldn't talk their way out of. "You too," he said, his voice cold as he turned to the officers. "Step away. We're handling this properly." The 2 officers, once brimming with arrogance, now looked defeated as they backed away. The stocky officer shot Julian a resentful glare, but Julian met his gaze with a look of unflinching resolve. As the supervisor began speaking into his radio, calling in for additional assistance, Julian knelt beside his mother once more, his voice low and filled with grief. "I'm so sorry, Mom," he whispered. "I should have been here sooner. I should have protected you." Despite her pain, Madeline managed a faint smile, her eyes filled with a love that even this brutality couldn't diminish. She reached out, placing a trembling hand on his arm. "You've always protected me, Julian," she said softly. "You're here now. That's what matters." Julian swallowed hard, his heart aching as he held her hand. He looked up at the crowd, at the people who had come together to stand with his mother, their faces filled with empathy and support. This wasn't just a single moment of injustice. It was a flashpoint, a symbol of the unchecked brutality that had gone on for too long. And Julian knew, as he looked around at the faces of the people who were watching, that he had a responsibility to his mother, to his community, and to himself. The crowd's chants grew louder, their voices unified in their call for justice. As he helped his mother into the waiting ambulance, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. A fire ignited within him. This was only the beginning. He would see these officers held accountable, not just for his mother, but for everyone who had suffered at the hands of a system that too often turned a blind eye. As the ambulance doors closed and he took one last look at the crowd, Julian felt a surge of determination. He would not rest. He would not be silent. He would fight because this time, the whole world was watching. The morning after the assault, Julian Wilson awoke to a phone buzzing with missed calls and messages. The footage of his confrontation with the officers had spread like wildfire, capturing the attention of local news and quickly gaining traction online. The images of Madeline, bruised, bloodied, and humiliated, had struck a chord with thousands, sparking a collective outcry for accountability. Julian glanced down at his phone, scrolling through messages from fellow attorneys, activists, and even strangers offering words of support and outrage. But his focus remained clear: justice for his mother. Not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion. As he prepared to leave the house, he felt the weight of his decision settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about challenging a system that had permitted abuse for far too long. As Julian headed to the hospital to visit Madeline, he mentally rehearsed his plan. His legal team had been working nonstop, gathering witness statements, collecting medical records, and preparing the groundwork for a formal lawsuit. But this case would require more than evidence. It needed visibility. A groundswell of public support that would hold the police department accountable and ensure systemic change. When Julian entered the hospital room, he found Madeline sitting up, her face bruised but her eyes as sharp as ever. She greeted him with a soft smile, the strength in her gaze unbroken despite her injuries. "Julian," she said, her voice gentle, "I've lived through a lot, but nothing quite like this." Julian took her hand, his expression serious. "Mom, I'm so sorry this happened to you, but I promise you, we're going to make this right." Madeline squeezed his hand, her smile unwavering. "I know you will, and I'm proud of you, Julian. This fight, it's bigger than me." Julian nodded, his jaw clenched with resolve. "It is. This is for every person who's ever been mistreated, for everyone who's ever felt powerless." He paused, looking into her eyes. "And it's for you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the battle ahead heavy but not insurmountable. Julian's mind was already racing with the legal strategies and media responses he would need to execute. He knew that this fight wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was necessary. By noon, Julian's legal team had set up a press conference outside the hospital. Word of Madeline's assault had spread rapidly, and the crowd gathered was larger than anyone had anticipated. News vans lined the street, cameras flashed, and reporters jostled for a spot close to the front, each eager to capture Julian's first public statement. As Julian approached the podium, a hush fell over the crowd. He took a deep breath, steadying himself before he addressed the sea of expectant faces. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Yesterday, my mother, Madeline Wilson, was the victim of a brutal assault by two police officers. officers who were sworn to protect and serve the public. Instead, they chose to abuse their power, targeting an elderly, disabled woman with unwarranted force. He paused, letting his words hang in the air, each one carrying the weight of the incident. The crowd was silent, riveted by his every word. "This is not an isolated incident," Julian continued, his voice gaining strength. "What happened to my mother happens to countless others every day, people who are often ignored, dismissed, and denied justice because of the color of their skin or their social status. But we're here to say enough. Enough of the abuse. Enough of the systemic neglect. Enough of the unchecked power." Reporters scribbled furiously as he spoke, capturing each line, each declaration. The crowd's energy shifted, their anger and empathy mingling as they absorbed his words. "My mother has dedicated her life to her community, to her family, and to her values," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "And I owe it to her, and to everyone who's ever been treated unjustly, to see this fight through to the end. We're not only seeking justice for her, but demanding accountability from a system that must change." He ended with a final, powerful statement. "We will not rest until those responsible are held accountable. And we won't stop there. We will continue until this system serves everyone fairly." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a powerful statement of solidarity. Reporters called out questions, eager for details, but Julian stepped back from the podium, allowing his words to speak for themselves. He knew the fight had only just begun, but he could feel the momentum building around him. Back at his office, Julian's legal team was ready to go. They had organized witness statements from people who had been at the scene, medical records that documented Madeline's injuries, and video footage from multiple angles. Each piece of evidence painted a damning picture of the abuse, each testimony adding weight to the case. The lawsuit they prepared wasn't just against the two officers. It was against the entire police department, charging them with fostering an environment where abuse went unchecked. Julian knew that to create lasting change, he needed to address the systemic issues that allowed officers to act with impunity. "Every detail matters," he told his team as they reviewed the evidence. "We need to make it impossible for them to dismiss this. The whole country is watching, and we're going to make sure that this case sets a precedent." One of his junior attorneys, a young woman named Mia, looked up from her notes with admiration. "Julian, this could be historic. If we win." "When we win," Julian corrected, his voice resolute. "We're not just fighting for my mother. We're fighting for everyone who deserves better." As news of the lawsuit spread, people began rallying in support. Crowds gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Madeline" and "End Police Brutality." The community, outraged by the blatant abuse, came together in a powerful display of solidarity, their voices demanding justice. Protests erupted not only in Julian City but in neighboring areas as well. Local activists joined forces, organizing marches, vigils, and rallies. Each event was filled with impassioned speeches, stories from survivors of similar abuse, and calls for accountability from law enforcement. The public was watching, and they weren't about to let the police department sweep this under the rug. Julian attended several of these rallies, his presence a rallying point for the movement. Standing before the crowds, he felt a surge of pride and determination as he saw the power of their collective voice. One evening, at a rally held in a nearby park, Julian took the stage to speak. He looked out at the faces of the crowd, young and old, black and white, each person united by a shared sense of purpose. "My mother is not just a victim," he began, his voice carrying through the evening air. She is a survivor, a fighter, and she represents every person who has been denied justice, every person who has suffered at the hands of those who should protect us. The crowd cheered, their voices echoing through the park. Julian continued, his voice filled with conviction. This fight is about accountability, but it's also about dignity. My mother deserves to be treated with respect, as does every single person standing here today. We will not stop until the system changes, until every badge stands for justice, not oppression. The rally ended with chants of justice for Madeline, ringing through the night. Julian walked off the stage, his heart full as he embraced the people who had gathered to support him. He felt their commitment, their willingness to stand with him in this fight, and he knew that together, they could make a difference. As the days passed and the lawsuit gained traction, Julian was approached by an unexpected ally, Detective Sarah Lang, a veteran officer within the department. She had heard about the case and was appalled by the actions of her colleagues. Though she had always prided herself on her integrity, the incident with Madeline had forced her to confront the flaws within her own department. One afternoon, she requested a meeting with Julian, reaching out through mutual connections. When they met, Sarah spoke candidly, her voice filled with regret. "Mr. Wilson, I want you to know that what those officers did was inexcusable," she said, her tone firm. "I've been with the force for over 15 years, and I've seen things that don't sit right. I believe in accountability, and if there's anything I can do to support your case, I will." Julian studied her carefully, assessing her sincerity. Sarah's presence offered a glimmer of hope, proof that there were still officers willing to stand up for justice, willing to expose wrongdoing within their own ranks. "Thank you, Detective Lang," Julian replied, extending his hand. "If you're willing to testify, your support could make a huge difference. We need people within the department to show that this behavior isn't tolerated by all." Sarah nodded, her expression resolute. "I'm prepared to do what's right, no matter the consequences." Their handshake was a silent pact, an alliance forged in the shared belief that justice must prevail. With the lawsuit underway, the community united, and unexpected allies emerging, Julian felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but with each passing day, his determination grew stronger. This wasn't just a fight for his mother. It was a battle for a future where no one would have to suffer as she had. As he prepared to face the police department in court, Julian was ready, and this time, he was fighting with the support of an entire movement behind him. The courthouse buzzed with tension as the case against the two officers and the police department officially began. The media filled the gallery, cameras flashing as spectators poured in, their faces set with anticipation. Outside, crowds of supporters gathered, holding signs demanding justice for Madeline and chanting for accountability. This case had become more than just a lawsuit. It had turned into a battle between a community and a system that had long failed it. Julian stood outside the courthouse doors, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He looked over at his mother, her frail form seated in her wheelchair beside him, her face lined with quiet resilience. Madeline had insisted on attending every day of the trial, determined to witness the fight for justice firsthand. "You ready, Mom?" Julian asked, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Madeline looked up at him, her eyes filled with pride. "I am. Let's make them hear our story." Julian took a deep breath, steeling himself for the day ahead. This wasn't just a court case. It was a moment that had the power to ripple far beyond the walls of the courtroom. As the trial began, Julian's opening statement was calm yet powerful, his voice resonating through the hushed room. He painted a vivid picture of the assault, describing his mother's quiet strength and the brutality she had endured at the hands of those sworn to protect her. He emphasized not only the physical injuries she had suffered, but the emotional trauma inflicted by the callous disregard for her dignity. "My mother, Madeline Wilson, was not a threat," Julian said, his tone steady but fierce. "She was not resisting arrest. She was a 70-year-old disabled woman, an elder of her community, who was subjected to senseless violence simply because she was there, because those officers decided they could act with impunity. Today, we are here to remind them, and everyone watching, that justice does not turn a blind eye." The opposing counsel, representing the police department, took the stand next. Their statement aimed to defend the officers' actions, framing them as a case of misjudged but necessary force. They claimed the officers had suspected Madeline of criminal activity and had acted according to standard procedures. But Julian could see through their rhetoric. He knew they were scrambling to cover for the inexcusable behavior of the two officers, trying to twist the narrative in their favor. His resolve hardened, determined to dismantle their justifications piece by piece. One by one, witnesses from the day of the incident took the stand. Neighbors, shopkeepers, and passers-by who had witnessed the assault recounted the scene with horror and empathy. Each testimony was another layer of evidence, a powerful reminder that Madeline had been targeted without cause and subjected to violence with no justification. An elderly woman who lived on the same street as Madeline described the disbelief she'd felt watching the officers throw Madeline to the ground. "I couldn't believe my eyes," the woman said, her voice trembling. "She was so helpless, and they were so cruel. It was like they didn't see her as a person at all." Another witness, a young man who had recorded part of the incident, described the officers' hostility and the crowd's rising outrage. "I thought they'd stop when they saw everyone watching," he said, glancing briefly at the officers seated across the room. "But they didn't. They didn't care. They were rough with her even when people started yelling for them to stop." Each witness statement painted a damning picture of the officers' actions, building a case that was as emotional as it was factual. Julian listened intently, his heart swelling with both anger and gratitude as the community came together to support his mother. When it was Madeline's turn to testify, the courtroom held its breath. Her frail frame seemed even smaller in the witness box, but her voice carried a quiet strength that silenced the room. She recounted her day, the simple trip to the bank, the moments leading up to the encounter with the officers, and then the sudden violence that had erupted without warning. "They looked at me like I didn't belong," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I've lived in that neighborhood for more than 30 years. And I'd never felt so unwelcome until that day." The opposing counsel attempted to rattle her, questioning her actions, implying that her resistance might have provoked the officers. But Madeline met each question with calm defiance, refusing to be intimidated. "I may be old," she said, her voice unwavering, "but I know my rights. I know that what they did to me wasn't lawful. And I know that they acted the way they did because they thought I didn't matter." When Julian took the opportunity to cross-examine his mother, he met her gaze with a look of fierce pride and respect. "Mom," he began gently, "how did this experience affect you?" Madeline looked down for a moment, gathering her thoughts before answering. "It took something from me," she admitted, her voice soft but resolute. "It made me feel less safe, less human, and no one should ever be made to feel that way." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air, resonating with everyone present. Halfway through the trial, Julian received word that Detective Sarah Lang, who had approached him during the preparations for the case, was ready to testify. Sarah's experience as a police officer within the same department as the accused officers added a new dimension to the trial. Her willingness to testify against her own colleagues was a courageous act that Julian knew could make a critical difference. As she took the stand, the courtroom murmured in surprise. Julian approached her with respect, understanding the weight of her decision. "Detective Lang," he began, "can you tell the court why you decided to testify in this case?" Sarah's face was grave as she looked at the jury. "I've been with this department for over 15 years, and I've seen officers act in ways that don't align with our oath to protect and serve," she said. "But this, what happened to Mrs. Wilson, is a line that should never have been crossed. I'm here because it's the right thing to do." She went on to describe the culture within the department, the us versus them mentality that often overshadowed justice. She spoke of the subtle encouragement of silence, the expectation that officers would cover for each other, no matter the cost. "I'm here because Mrs. Wilson deserves better," she said, her voice filled with conviction, "and because I believe that the law should apply equally to all of us, whether we wear a badge or not." Julian could feel the weight of her words resonating with the jury, each statement a powerful indictment against the department's culture of impunity. In the days that followed, the defense attempted to discredit Julian and his case, painting him as a lawyer with a vendetta against law enforcement. They argued that his passion for justice was clouding his objectivity, that he was using his mother's case as a platform to stir up trouble. But Julian met each accusation head-on, refusing to back down. When they suggested that his pursuit of justice was fueled by personal ambition, he responded with quiet defiance. "My ambition is justice," he said, his voice filled with a calm intensity. "If that means holding those in power accountable, then yes, I'll pursue it relentlessly, and I won't apologize for that." The defense's arguments fell flat, their attempts to sway the jury backfiring as Julian's unwavering dedication became clear. The community's support only grew stronger, with more people attending the trial each day, their presence a testament to the importance of the fight. The day of the closing arguments arrived, and Julian took his place before the jury, his heart pounding with both anger and hope. This was his chance to make a final plea, to convey the full weight of what had happened to his mother and why justice needed to be served. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice strong and steady, "what happened to my mother was not just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a system that has, for too long, allowed abuse to go unchecked. These officers thought they could act without consequence. They thought they could assault a defenseless woman in broad daylight because they assumed no one would care." He paused, meeting each juror's gaze with an intensity that demanded attention. "But we care. This community cares. And we're here to say that no one, no matter how powerful, has the right to strip another human being of their dignity." Julian recounted the testimonies, the videos, the evidence that painted a clear picture of brutality. His voice softened as he spoke of his mother, a woman who had spent her life contributing to her community, only to be treated with cruelty by those who should have protected her. "My mother may never fully recover from this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But today, you have the power to send a message that says justice applies to everyone, that dignity is a right, not a privilege." As he concluded, the courtroom sat in stunned silence, the weight of his words resonating with everyone present. The jury retired to deliberate, and the courtroom was filled with a tense silence as Julian and Madeline waited, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They had fought tirelessly, presented their case with clarity and passion. Now, all they could do was wait. Outside, the chants of justice for Madeline echoed through the hallways, a powerful reminder that this was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for respect, equality, and lasting change. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed back into the room, their expressions unreadable. Julian sat beside his mother, his hands folded tightly on the table, the tension in his body palpable. Madeline, seated in her wheelchair, looked calm but weary, her eyes fixed on the jury, determined to face whatever came next with dignity. The judge, a stern woman with a deep voice, looked at the head juror. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the juror replied, standing up and holding a folded piece of paper. Every eye in the courtroom was fixed on him, the air thick with anticipation. Julian reached over, giving his mother's hand a reassuring squeeze. Madeline met his gaze, her eyes softening as she nodded. She had endured so much, and now they stood at the edge of justice, hopeful but uncertain. The juror unfolded the paper and cleared his throat, his voice ringing through the courtroom. "We, the jury, find the defendants." He paused, and the room held its breath. "Guilty on all counts." A wave of relief washed over Julian as the courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. He felt his shoulders relax, a mixture of gratitude and pride filling him as he turned to his mother, her face lighting up with a soft, triumphant smile. Madeline reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly as her eyes filled with tears. The judge's gavel struck down, silencing the room. She turned to address the defendants, her voice carrying a tone of finality. "The actions you have committed represent a betrayal of the public trust and a blatant abuse of authority. This verdict is a message to all. No one is above the law, and those who carry a badge must carry it with integrity." The officers sat across the room, their faces pale, their bravado gone. They seemed smaller, diminished, as they faced the consequences of their actions. Julian watched them, feeling a surge of satisfaction mixed with a solemn recognition of the journey that had brought them here. This wasn't just about punishing individuals, it was about challenging a culture of unchecked power, about ensuring that dignity and justice were upheld. As Julian and Madeline stepped out of the courthouse, they were met with the sight of hundreds of supporters who had gathered outside, holding signs and chanting for justice. The moment they appeared, a roar of applause erupted from the crowd, and the chants of justice for Madeline filled the air. News cameras flashed, capturing the historic moment, as people reached out to congratulate them, expressing gratitude and admiration. Julian lifted his hand to wave, his heart swelling with pride. But this victory was bittersweet. He looked down at his mother, her face beaming as she took in the crowd. But he knew that the scars, physical and emotional, would take much longer to heal. As he helped her down the courthouse steps, a reporter rushed forward, holding out a microphone. "Mr. Wilson, Ms. Wilson, do you have any words now that the verdict has been reached?" Julian paused, glancing at his mother, who gave him a nod of encouragement. He took a deep breath, addressing the crowd with a sense of purpose. "This verdict is a step toward accountability, but it's only the beginning. Today, we stand here because we believe that justice should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their age, their race, or their circumstances." He turned, gesturing to his mother, his voice filled with emotion. "My mother taught me the importance of integrity, of standing up for what's right. no matter the cost. And this fight isn't just for her. It's for every person who has felt powerless, who has been mistreated, and who deserves better. The crowd cheered, their voices a chorus of unity and strength. Julian felt a surge of determination as he looked out at the faces surrounding them, the people who had become part of this journey. This was more than just a single case. It was a movement that had gained momentum, driven by a shared belief in justice. In the weeks that followed, the verdict sent shockwaves through the city. The police department was ordered to undergo a full investigation, and a task force was assembled to address the systemic issues that had allowed abuse of power to go unchecked. Mandatory sensitivity and accountability training were implemented, and new policies were established, including a zero-tolerance policy for brutality and misconduct. Julian used his platform to advocate for these reforms, collaborating with local leaders and community organizers to ensure the changes were implemented and monitored. He delivered speeches at city council meetings, stood in front of news cameras, and spoke on panels, his voice unwavering as he called for a system that truly served and protected everyone. Madeline, meanwhile, became an unlikely symbol of resilience and strength. Though her body bore the marks of the ordeal, her spirit was unbroken, and she attended rallies and spoke at events, sharing her story with grace and courage. Her testimony had not only helped secure justice for herself but had ignited a wave of awareness and change. One quiet evening, Julian and Madeline sat together on her porch, watching the sun set over the city. It had been a whirlwind of media attention, court proceedings, and community organizing. But tonight, they took a moment to simply be in each other's company, to savor the victory they had worked so hard to achieve. Madeline broke the silence, her voice soft. "I never thought I'd live to see something like this. Julian, so much has changed." Julian nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It has, and it's because of you, Mom. Your strength, your courage. None of this would have been possible without you." She looked over at him, her eyes filled with pride. "I didn't do it alone," she said gently. "You've become a man who fights for what's right. I'm proud of you, Julian." They sat together, the weight of the journey finally beginning to lift. The city was changing, slowly but surely, and they had been part of that change. They had taken their pain and transformed it into power, creating a legacy that would ripple far beyond their own lives. Months later, Madeline and Julian attended the inauguration of a new community center named in Madeline's honor. The Madeline Wilson Center for Justice and Community Empowerment was dedicated to supporting those who had been victims of abuse and providing resources for families affected by systemic injustice. The center offered legal support, counseling, and educational workshops, ensuring that others would have the support Madeline hadn't had that fateful day. As Madeline took the stage at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, she looked out at the crowd with gratitude. She spoke briefly, her voice strong and unwavering. "This center is not just for me," she said. "It's for every person who deserves to be treated with respect and humanity. May it be a place of healing, hope, and justice." The applause that followed was thunderous, and Julian felt a surge of emotion as he watched his mother. This journey, which had begun in pain and suffering, had transformed into something beautiful, a movement, a place of refuge, and a beacon of justice. As they left the ceremony, Julian felt a profound sense of fulfillment. He looked down at his mother, her head held high, and thought of the countless lives they had touched, the system they had begun to reshape. "Mom," he said, his voice filled with pride. "We did it. We made a difference." Madeline nodded, a soft smile playing on her lips. "Yes, Julian, and the work has only just begun. They walked into the future, side by side, ready to continue the fight, knowing that their journey had not only changed them but had sparked a movement that would carry on. A legacy of courage, resilience, and justice,